Hello and welcome back to the Nutrition and Life podcast. My name is Lisa, I'm your host, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. She is a science communicator and author of the book, The Radical New Science for Getting the Nutrients You Need from the Food That You Eat. Her company is called Nutrivore, and I am super excited to talk to her about all things immune health, metabolic health, gut health today. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
My absolute pleasure. And yeah, I can't wait to hear more about your New York Times bestselling book. And before we do so, though, I would love to hear a little bit more about you, just what brought you to where you are today and your journey through being a science communicator.
Yeah, I wish I could say it was like a straight line, like this thing happened, then this thing happened, then this thing happened. But instead, I think I've been a little bit all over the place. It basically started with me really struggling with my health and my weight through university. So I was obese by the time I was in my late teens and had a lot of symptoms that turned out later to be attributable to autoimmune disease, but I didn't understand that at the time. And one of the things that happened as the result of like me just really trying to lose weight, I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, so my thyroid gland is not it's not pulling its weight. It's not doing the job that it's supposed to do. And so I was, it was the 90s. I was engaging in the restrictive dietary mindsets and popular diets of the 90s. So I was yo-yoing, and a large part of that was driven by undiagnosed health conditions, but a large part of that was driven by learned disordered eating patterns, which is a very common experience. And I was just really struggling. So at the same time as I was getting a PhD in medical biophysics and doing medical research, I was really struggling with my health. And it actually I lost over 100 pounds or early grad school, so like in between undergraduate and like the first year or so of graduate school. And then I had a massive health crisis and gained it all back again. And then as a postdoc, I had my first daughter. And I had gestational diabetes and realized that I was borderline type 2 diabetic, which was a big kick in the pants. And I worked really hard to lose. That time it was like 130 pounds. Again, over a couple of years, and still was really struggling. So I still had migraines and acid reflux and irritable bowel syndrome. I still had all kinds of skin things. I had, chronic constipation and just felt really gross. And it was the realization, I think, that losing weight was not making me healthier and that I was really still struggling with my health, that was the beginning of me applying my medical research background and my science knowledge to the problem of my own health. It was from there, still many years before I really um, faced how much incorrect knowledge I had learned about nutrition from different diets and how harmful a restrictive mindset when it comes to food is. And so that part of my both personal and professional journey is much more recent, and why I have established Nutrivore as a dietary philosophy, but not a dietary template. So Nutrivore is simply the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. And that simple goal, right? It makes sense, right? That would be the whole purpose of nourishment. But it liberates us from a couple of like really damaging, I think, like diet mentalities. So when you start to look at the quality of the whole diet, so you just say like, are there enough of those health promoting foods in this whole diet to support long-term health, right? We've got certain foods that we know over and over and over again, the more of them we eat, the healthier we are on average, right? There's no guarantee, but we can reduce our risk of health problems pretty dramatically with our day-to-day choices. And so if you look at is there enough of those? If the answer is yes, great, check in the pro column. Is the sum of all of the nutrients contained within the foods that I ate today, does that add up to meet or safely exceed the daily demands of my body while staying within my caloric requirements. Yes, that's the next like big check. So if that is how we're measuring the the goodness of a diet, does it matter if one of the foods I ate didn't contribute very much, right? It wasn't one of those foods that supports my long-term health, but it didn't take away from the foods that I did eat that support my long-term health. And it's not a food that has a lot of nutrients, but I met my nutritional needs. I stayed within my caloric requirements. It doesn't matter, right? With the science would tell us over and over and over again, it doesn't matter. So if one of the foods I ate in the day was a donut, awesome. I had a food that I loved, right? And so it gives us permission to intentionally incorporate what I call quality of life foods to ensure that we're getting enough joy from our overall healthier eating patterns that it's sustainable, right? That it becomes a lifelong healthy habit rather than a thing we go on again and off again. And I think my decades, I did eventually have to lose 100 pounds a third time. My decades of battling with my weight, battling with my health, um, first applying my science background to the problem of my health and then realizing that I had fallen for a lot of misinformation and pseudoscience type like logical fallacies and ways of thinking and then having to like unlearn all of that both like the personal growth as well as the professional journey are all interwoven into Nutrivore as a knowledge framework for informing our day-to-day choices so that we can have a higher quality diet so that we can reach our short-term health goals so that we can protect our long-term health all while leaving that sort of diet mentality in the past.
I absolutely love that, and I will say that when I read the parts of Nutrivore that you were so kind to share, um, my first thought was, wow, I love how much this is focused on what we should be eating or what we want to have more of, as opposed to thinking like less of this, don't eat that, and so on. So this is just a wonderful way to frame it and to focus on, because as you and I know, like the more the if we eat more of the good stuff, we automatically eat less of the quote unquote bad stuff. And
Yes.
you also said so wonderfully, like, while do we check both buckets? Like, number one, our micronutrients, and are we actually absorbing them? Are we actually utilizing them well?
Yep.
And number two, is that still within our calorie requirements? Because I do also meet several women or people in general that say like, oh, but I eat healthy and I eat this and this, and they like pour cups of olive oil over, all their food, and are not at the body weight that they want to be at, or not at a healthy body fat level. So that does pose a problem as well, because while good
Mm,
healthy fatty acids is something we want to have in our diet, we don't need that kind of caloric excess. Then we get into the
right.
just toxic caloric exceeding, and we don't want that either. So yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about your background with us. And also another thing that really stood out to me when looking at the outline of Nutrivore was just that you categorize things so nicely and so easy to understand for people. And one thing you spoke about in there was 12 nutrition food families, and essentially, and I would love
Yep.
to hear what they are and what each one of them is good for us.
Yeah. So when you start to look at like how do I craft a diet so that I'm meeting my nutritional minerals, amino acids, healthy fatty acids, phytonutrients that my body needs to attain its best health, you quickly realize a couple of things. First of all, you realize there's like a million different ways to do this. So you absolutely can cater a healthy eating pattern to your own preferences, your budget, your time and energy that you have to prepare food. But you also start to see the patterns emerge, right? So the types of foods that check all those boxes, right? So they're foods that have something really unique to offer us nutritionally, or they're just packed with nutrition, so they make it really easy to hit those nutrient goals. And they're the foods that when we focus on adding more of them, it expedites the process of like reaching that goal of getting all of the nutrients my body needs from the foods that I eat each day. They're not right? They're not necessarily non-negotiable. So as I go through those 12 foods, I want to just sort of emphasize that if one of the listeners hates one of those foods or is allergic to one of those foods or doesn't eat one of those foods for medical reasons or religious or ethical reasons, that's okay. But that should be a little aha. These are the foods that have something really important to offer me nutritionally. If I don't eat one of these foods, I do need to figure out what nutrients I'm missing out on and where else to get them from. So they are the foods that can not just expedite that process, but be part of that knowledge base of informing day-to-day choices if they're foods that aren't compatible with our preferences, budget, and other dietary requirements. So really there's 12, but we can actually just kind of talk about the first five. I think when we start talking about 12, it gets very overwhelming. So we'll hone on five first, because one of them is just vegetables. There's some vegetable families that also deserve a little special attention. So they're also part of this 12. But vegetables in general, they reduce risk of everything. I mean, just about everything that can go wrong with us health-wise. They obviously don't reduce risk of heritable genetic diseases, but pretty much everything else, right? Not just chronic illness, but even lowering our susceptibility to infectious disease. A vegetable-rich diet is the single best understood, most science to support, highest magnitude of benefit hallmark of a healthy diet, one that supports our long-term health. So I mean, I could sit here and list health conditions that eating lots of vegetables reduces risk of for the next 20 minutes, probably. If I had the list in front of me, I obviously can't remember every single health condition off the top of my head. But science basically shows that it's a little bit mixed, actually. So I think most of the evidence says that 5 servings or more vegetables per day is optimal. A serving is defined as 1 cup measured raw, which shrinks down to about half a cup cooked for most vegetables, but 2 cups for leafy vegetables. That still shrinks down to about a half a cup when cooked, or even less, right? 2 cups of spinach shrinks down to like a third of a cup when it's cooked. So it's not as like when I say 5 servings, I think a lot of people get very scared. But it's not as much as you think. You're probably closer than you think, right? There's a difference between portion size and serving size. Serving size is what is standardized in science to measure the benefits of something, whereas the portion is how much you put on your plate. And you probably, when you're serving yourself steamed broccoli, your portion of steamed broccoli is probably 2 servings of steamed broccoli. So it's not, I promise it's not as hard as you think it is. Also, you can build up to that slowly. It doesn't have to be like you flip a switch and all of a sudden your diet's perfect. You're allowed to implement this step by step and figure out whatever the easiest next step is to do. That's the next step to work on so that we can build the consistency that turns these into lifelong healthy eating patterns instead of a diet that we do for a short period of time and then stop. So first is vegetables. For 5 servings of vegetables per day, that reduces all-cause mortality risk, which is a indirect measurement of overall health and longevity that's used in scientific studies to determine whether or not something is good or bad for us overall. It reduces all-cause mortality risk by about 25%, which translates to about an extra 2.5 years of health span and lifespan, yeah, it's worth it to me. Like that's a big deal. So the first one is vegetables. Again, there's 5 vegetable families that deserve a little extra attention, but we can work on vegetables first and then like up the ante with extra focus on the individual vegetable families. The next, what I call foundational food, is fruit. So fruit in like wellness communities and health conscious communities sometimes gets a really bad rap for being, nature's candy and being full, fructose bombs and full of sugar. But studies show that 2 or 3 servings of fruit per day is optimal from a health perspective. There are some health conditions actually that fruit has a higher magnitude of benefit than vegetables. So one of those is like high blood pressure. Another one is metabolic syndrome. So fruit is actually having a bigger benefit than vegetables. So we're missing out if we don't eat fruit and we just eat vegetables. And we're talking here the culinary definitions. So we're putting tomatoes go into the vegetable category. When I say fruit, I mean sweet fruit, like pineapple and mangoes and strawberries and apples and grapes, right? Like just the things that we feel like, oh no, It's too much fructose. But eating 2 or 3 servings per day reduces risk of all-cause mortality by about 10%. That's a roughly another year of health span and lifespan. And fruit and vegetables, there's a tiny bit of overlap in terms of health benefit because there's overlap in nutrients, but there's a lot of ways that they're benefiting our health independently. So we wouldn't say 1 year plus 2.5 years, but maybe together, maybe that's 3 years, right? Like we're still getting that additive benefit, even if it's not perfectly additive. And actually, what's really interesting, so with vegetables, there's kind of like no maximum. You're going to keep benefiting from vegetables the more of them you add. With fruit, it's going to kind of plateau. So above 3 servings of fruit, you're not going to get an additional benefit. But most studies show you're not going to lose any benefit either. Some show that like up above 6 servings per day, it's kind of not as good as 2 or 3. But that's also an amount of fruit consumption where you're displacing other nutritionally important foods. So it may not be so much the fruit so much as if you're eating that much fruit, you're probably not eating as much vegetables or not eating nuts and seeds or legumes, which are the next two. So food number 3 is legumes. So we're really talking about pulse type legumes like beans, lentils, and chickpeas. We've got legumes like green beans or like fresh peas. Those get again, culinary definitions, those get categorized with vegetables. So we're really talking about the types of beans that you can get, like canned kidney beans or dried black beans, right? We're trying to talk about those beans. So studies again show a really big difference between about 4 servings per week and like less than a serving per week. That again is going to reduce risk of all-cause mortality in that 20 to 25% range. And what's fascinating about legumes is we don't see the benefits like level off until we're consuming about 1.5 servings per day. So a serving for legumes is defined as half a cup cooked. So again, it's probably less than you were thinking. A half cup is not very much. I should have mentioned for fruit, it's also a cup, just like vegetables. For fruit, it translates to a medium-sized fruit about the same size as your fist, so like medium apple, medium orange. So for legumes, it's half a cup. And so 4 servings per week is a great minimum to aim for. But if you want to eat them every day, that's great. Like you're still going to get health benefits from that. Even eating, 2 or 3 servings per day is going to be awesome. Legumes are actually the most nutrient-dense starchy foods. So they've got lots of protein, lots of fiber, tons of vitamins and minerals. They're actually really high in polyphenols, which I certainly did not realize until I was like digging into the data. You think polyphenols, you think coffee, tea, right? Vegetables, fruit. We definitely don't think legumes, but legumes are some of the most concentrated sources of polyphenols we can eat. So that is food group number 3. Food group number 4 is nuts and seeds. So if you're allergic to nuts, that would be seeds. Peanuts counts here. Peanut doesn't count with legumes. They count with nuts and seeds. We categorize things according to the culinary definitions because the culinary uses is chemistry, right? So how I use something in my kitchen is based on the chemistry. Nutrients are chemicals. So the same things that are making a food good for a certain culinary purpose are nutrients. So if we categorize by nutrients, we just end up with the same answer as when we categorize by culinary use. So that's why peanuts get categorized with nuts and seeds. Nutritionally, they're very similar, and in our kitchens, we use them very similarly, right? Like if you can't eat peanuts, you might replace them with almonds, right, in a recipe, for example. So up to about an ounce per day. So 4 1-ounce servings per week is kind of like the minimum to aim for health benefits. Nuts and seeds, we're talking an ounce per day, which is just like what would fit in the palm of your hand, about 2 tablespoons of a nut butter if you were going to do the nut butter form. That reduces all-cause mortality risk, depending on this exact study you're looking at, 30 to 35%. It's a huge benefit. And that's, I mean, we can dig into why, because I think it's one of the most undervalued foods. And because nuts and seeds are really energy dense, a lot of people who come from weight loss centered diets are scared of them, right? We're like, oh my gosh, yeah, but that 1 ounce of nuts and seeds has like 300 calories. Therefore, I'm terrified. Plus, they're really easy to eat more than an ounce, right? They're really easy to keep going. But what's fascinating is there's all this research showing that people who eat more nuts and seeds actually lose weight, that it actually helps them maintain a lower body weight. So we don't need to fear them. And given their nutrient profiles and how great they are at filling the gaps of some of the most common nutrient deficiencies, definitely a food to highlight. And then the fifth food, and this is why I prefaced by saying if something is not something you eat, this is really the one I'm talking about, is seafood. So fish and shellfish. I realize these are both in the top 8 allergens separately, right? Fish and shellfish. And I know they're not compatible with a lot of dietary templates that people follow for different reasons. But fish and shellfish are double to triple to quadruple the nutrient density of like the common meats that you might eat otherwise if you were going to eat chicken or beef or pork instead. They're about double the nutrient density of even your most nutrient dense plant proteins. They are our best food sources of omega-3 fats, which are incredibly important for like every biological system. And studies show about 3 servings per week is a great minimum target. But again, there's no cap in benefits. So you can eat seafood up to every single meal and continue to get health benefit from that. But 3 servings per week translates to approximately a 10% reduction in all-cause mortality. So these are all the foods that they're very nutrient dense. They each have something unique to offer us that we can't get or we can't get easily from other foods. And they're the foods that have the like most deep and rigorous body of scientific literature showing long-term health benefits, long-term reductions in risk for diseases like cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, all of the things that will erode quality of life as we age. All of our risks of those are dramatically reduced by eating those 5 foods. Then the rest of the 12 are vegetable families and fruit families that get a little extra focus just because they have something special. So these are next level. Focus on the 5 first. Once we're hitting those minimum serving targets of those 5, then we can start to like tweak. So in the vegetable families that get a little extra focus, the first is cruciferous vegetables. So this is the cabbage family. So that includes foods like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, collard greens, arugula, radishes, um, I started by Brussels sprouts. It's a really large vegetable family. So when you walk, they're pretty easy to find at just about any grocery store. You're going to have at least 10 or 12 options of a cruciferous vegetable in the produce aisle. They have a class of phytonutrients called glucosinolates, which are extraordinarily beneficial, especially for reducing risk of cardiovascular disease and reducing risk of cancer. Some of our most cancer preventive compounds we can get from our diets. And then it's a class of nutrients. So there's 60-ish, I think, if I remember correctly. Some of them are also very good at reducing risk of type 2 diabetes, and some of them are also very good at reducing risk of Alzheimer's disease. So we've got some like extra little benefits in there from individual ones. So that's what kind of makes cruciferous vegetables worth a little extra focus. And ideally, like 1 serving a day, right? 7 servings per week, right? On average, it's a great target for getting the benefits of those glucosinolates. There's a similar class of compounds in alliums, the onion family. So that would be your onions, garlic, chives, leeks, shallots, spring onions, right? All of those types of families. That's a class of phytonutrients called thiosulfonates. Thiosulfonates work slightly differently. So we have an additive benefit over glucosinolates, but kind of do all the same things, right? In terms of health outcomes. So reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, some of our best cancer preventive compounds that we can get from our diets. And then some are also very good at reducing risk of type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So 3 servings per week. So a serving for an onion would be a cup, but for garlic, it would be a tablespoon. So that's like 3 cloves. So pretty easy. Just a clove of garlic per day gets you your onion servings for the week. Just a extremely important class of phytonutrients that we can't get from any other food, right? Those are unique to alliums, just like the glucosinolates are unique to cruciferous vegetables. Root vegetables is a broader category, but they basically tend to have fiber types that are really great for our gut microbiomes, and that's what leads to so many amazing health benefits from root vegetables. They're another one worth aiming for at least 1 serving per day. That doesn't have to mean just starchy root vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes. We actually categorize winter squash, even though they're fruit, in with root vegetables just because of the nutrient profiles. But this can include non-starchy root vegetables too, like carrots. So it doesn't have to, or radishes, right? It doesn't have to just be starchy foods. Leafy vegetables also get a highlight. Again, they have types of sugars in them that are not sugars that we use, right? They're not like glucose, but they're sugars that are really good for gut bacteria. And they're our best food sources of vitamin K by a mile. They also tend to have lots of biotin and folate. Leafy vegetables, another one that like one of our vegetable servings per day ideally would be also a leafy vegetable. We can cross, right? So we've got kale and arugula and collard greens and mustard greens that are all both cruciferous vegetables and leafy vegetables. Like we can check more than one box with one serving of vegetable. Lots of root vegetables that are cruciferous vegetables, like radishes and turnip and rutabaga, right? So again, we can find the efficiency nutritionally. And then the last vegetable family that gets extra focus is mushrooms. Not even plants. They're technically fungi, but culinarily we categorize them as vegetables. So nutritionally we do as well because that the nutrients they have match vegetables quite well. But mushrooms have some things that are unique that we can't get from any of the plant vegetables, including some types of fiber we can't get anywhere else. Okay, we can get them from insects, but I think mushrooms are an easier sell. Um, they have some cool phytonutrients called triterpenes that are really hard to get from other sources. And the really important, like the coolest thing that mushrooms have is an antioxidant amino acid called ergothioneine that we don't use to make protein, but it still has a lot of biological roles in our body. And ergothioneine has been shown to decrease the risk of all of the health conditions associated with aging. And so much so, scientists have nicknamed it the longevity vitamin. So, ergothioneine, by far and away, our best food sources is mushrooms. So, mushrooms also 3-ish servings per week is a great target from a health perspective. So, those are our veggie families that get some extra focus. And then we have 2 fruit families. So, this is foods 11 and 12. One is berries. Berries have types of fiber that we can get in other places, but they're a very reliable source of especially lignin fiber types and anthocyanins. Anthocyanins are a class of polyphenols that are uniquely able to cross the blood-brain barrier, where they can have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant benefits. But one of the other cool things that they do is actually interact with pain receptors to lower pain. Anthocyanins are not just good for chronic pain, but they're really good for our eye health. So they reduce risk of cataracts, age-related macular degeneration. They are really good for muscle recovery. So they're really good for athletes to help with performance. And they're very good at reducing risk of neurodegenerative disease. So think Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, in addition to all antioxidants reduce risk of cardiovascular disease, right? Like there's all antioxidants are good for that. And then the last fruit family is citrus. So oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruit. There's like 2,000 different citrus fruits. You're probably only gonna get 5 or 6 different ones in your store. But citrus fruits have more polyphenols that are really unique. So the citrus polyphenols is kind of how they're classified, include things like naringin, hesperidin, hesperitin, which, fun fact, increase the bioavailability of the vitamin C in citrus fruit by up to about 2.5 times. So even though citrus fruit doesn't have the most vitamin C per serving of foods, it has highly bioavailable vitamin C. So that's why citrus fruit is such a great source of vitamin C and why oldie-timey sailors were called limeys because of the limes that they were consuming to prevent scurvy. But citrus fruit has especially benefits for mental health, thanks to that collection of polyphenols and vitamin C, in addition to reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the added benefits of citrus fruit include lowering risk of anxiety-related disorders and depression. So that is all 12, what I call Nutrivore foundational foods. It can feel like an overwhelming list. So I feel like I should just mention I have a couple of tools for keeping track. So if you just want just like the list and some examples, I have a free download. It's just explains these foods, available when you sign up for my weekly newsletter. So if you go to Nutrivore.com and click on join in the top right corner, That's where my weekly newsletter is. And there's 5 free guides that come when you sign up, and that's one of them. And then I also have something called the Nutrivore Weekly Serving Matrix, which is basically a checklist to keep track of all of these different foods and the recommended servings for each one. And that is both included in my book, which is a very comprehensive resource. So that's probably the best way to get it because you get so much else. But I also have a digital resource for that on my site if you would prefer a digital resource. So if it feels like a lot, I have already thought ahead about that and created resources just to help you keep track and understand like what counts as what.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for explaining all these different food groups in detail. And also, what I love about it is that you are giving us the actual serving size and the sense of what it cooks down to, etc., and even how many times per week and so on. I think that makes it a lot more. People probably like when you were talking us through that, I was already like, okay, yeah, normally I could include that in my breakfast. I have that in my lunch because most of us we eat the same things on a regular basis. So
Yeah.
if you make it a habit of having a mixture of berries and maybe oranges in your breakfast or whatever, you're already ticking 2 off of that list. Or
Yeah.
in your lunches, if you alternate between broccoli and cauliflower and chucking in some carrots or beetroot, depending on what you feel like, that's another 2 categories. And I, for one, like I love cruciferous vegetables. I mean, first of all, taste
Yeah.
wise, but secondly, just for their function as well. And I work with a lot of perimenopausal and menopausal women. And so we really, really want to focus on supporting that liver detox as best as we can because hormones are out of whack anyway. So we need to give our liver the most love that we possibly can. And for that reason, I love everything that you said about them as well. Because yeah,
There's actually a glucosinolate. Broccoli's a great source. It's got a really long chemical name, but we often shorten it to DIM, which is especially beneficial for postmenopausal women because it basically helps to push estrogen metabolism towards the form that lowers risk of breast and ovarian cancer, as opposed to pushing estrogen metabolism towards the form that increases risk. So it can be extremely beneficial. I mean, for females of all ages, but especially in that postmenopausal period, because that's when, sadly, our risks of not fun health times starts to increase. In addition to all of the rude stuff like hot flashes and weight gain and skin sagging, just that's the insult to the injury. The injury is like, oh, cardiovascular disease and cancer risk dramatically increasing, osteoporosis and sarcopenia. Yeah,
throw what else can we throw in there? Yes, exactly.
right.
Thank you for highlighting that. And I will say that it was new to me that mushrooms in particular are so unique in some of their micronutrients. I mean, of course, I was aware of the fact that they're beneficial, but I didn't know that they had that unique of a position
Yeah.
in there. So yeah, thank you. I will certainly make it a point of including them more into my diet. But I am also curious, so when people hear variety of vegetables and fruit and so on, some might have heard that recommendation of like, oh, you should eat the rainbow, like a variety of
Yeah.
colors. And is that when you are speaking about dietary diversity or mixing it up, is that kind of what you're talking about, or is there a differentiation between the two?
Oh, yeah. So there's like 3 different concepts here that overlap. So one is eating the rainbow, as you said. So that is hitting the 5 different color families of count fruits and vegetables mainly, but we can also count like legumes, nuts, and seeds in them. So the 5 colors are red, orange and yellow, green, blue and purple, and white and brown. So white and brown, we're going to count things like, legumes or nuts and seeds. And the reason why we break things up that way is because the phytonutrients that are giving fruits and vegetables their distinctive colors also have distinctive health benefits. So we have this like better coverage in terms of health benefits when we're thinking about hitting those 5 different color families. Ideally every day, but we really don't have really concrete science to say, does it have to be every day? Is it okay if it's covered throughout the week? Like we don't really have a solid answer to that question yet. I think in the absence of that question, aiming for every day and then not really like not worrying about it if we don't, get it one day or 3 days of the week, right? Like just trying, I think, is a reasonable approach to that. So eating the rainbow is very much about the phytonutrients that give fruits and vegetables their distinctive color. Separately from that, we have all of this research showing that high dietary diversity is one of the most important long-term healthy eating patterns. So this just refers to like how many different whole foods are represented in our overall diet. And again, the science isn't super concrete, but for example, one of my favorite studies was published in 2022. They followed nearly 500,000 people living in 9 European countries for an average of 10 years. And they showed that the people who had the most diverse diet, they measured something called dietary species richness. So it's the number of different species represented in the diet as a way of measuring whole foods. And they measured that over the course of a year, right? So how many different species in the diet for a whole year? The people who consumed 81 or more different species in a year had a 38% reduced risk of all-cause mortality compared to the people who consumed, I think it was 48 was there or less different species in the year. And they basically showed that for every 10 additional species, it was about a 10% reduction in all-cause mortality. That is a ridiculously huge effect. And what this study showed, and there's been other studies to kind of confirm this, is that it didn't really matter where that diversity was coming from. Vegetables were maybe a titch more important, but it wasn't like a giant signal. And really you could see like diversity of animal foods versus plant foods. It just didn't matter. It was just like diversity of foods. Now, there's a couple of reasons why a diverse diet is so beneficial in terms of an eating pattern. One is the more different foods you eat, just the more likely it is you've got all your nutritional bases covered, right? The diversity of foods equals diversity of nutrients, and diversity of foods kind of also means probably diversity of phytonutrients, right? If you're eating a lot of different foods, you're probably also eating the rainbow. The other thing is there's certain things that we don't want to eat too much of, right? We don't want more than 10% of our calories to come from added sugars. We don't want more than 10% of our calories to come from saturated fat. We don't want to get more than like 5 grams of sodium per day. There's certain additives and preservatives that, little bits here and there is fine, but we don't want to exceed the acceptable daily intake levels of those compounds. So when we're eating a diversity of foods, that also protects us from overdoing something that might be harmful in a large amount. So dietary diversity, overlapping concept with Eat the Rainbow, but still kind of a separate concept. And then the like third concept here is food families, right? So breaking up these larger food groups like vegetables into the individual plant families that are collections of vegetables like cruciferous vegetables, root vegetables, leafy vegetables, mushrooms, alliums. We could add like the parsley family. We could add the beet family. Like there's lots of other families of vegetables. The thistle family, which is just artichokes and cardoons. That's it, but that's the thistle family. Um, the 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 reason why that's still worthy of focus on top of dietary diversity is you could have a very diverse diet and miss a whole really important vegetable family. You could be eating the rainbow and still not have a diverse diet, or be eating the rainbow and not have a really important like vegetable family, right? So having all three of those concepts in our heads, right? They obviously overlap. Chances are good if you're eating a diverse diet, there's some cruciferous vegetables and mushrooms in there, but not like automatically, right? There's like ways that you can kind of, especially routine is obviously, I'm a big fan of routine. I'm also a person who likes certain aspects of my day to be extremely predictable. There's some mental health benefits to routine, right? And schedule and predictability. There's some mental health benefits to spontaneity as well. But when we fall into a rut, often it's coping, right? We're eating the same foods every single day because there's something else in our life that is taking our mental energy. And so it's just easier to have food be routine and not be a decision point 3 times per day. So, like, especially when we're in those periods of time where we need routine, that's where thinking about these concepts, okay, I'm going to eat the same things every day, but I can still have a diverse diet and I can still eat the rainbow and I can still get all of these fruits and vegetable families. I just need to think about where each one of these things is coming from so that even though I'm in a routine, I still have those nutritional bases covered. And so I think that's why kind of understanding the overlap between those three concepts, because really they all boil down to eat lots of different kinds of foods. But they are sort of different ways of measuring it, and there are different, like there is different rationale for each one. So ideally we would have all of those on our radar.
Super cool. I never thought about it in that way. And really, you either hear one recommendation or the other. So I love that you're highlighting how with one focus you might still be missing things. And just generally, like even if someone listens to all that wonderful information that you're providing us with and reads your book and so on, what are some of the most common deficiencies we see today? Or where might people, even if they're trying very hard, fall short commonly?
So there's four essential nutrients for which 90% of Americans never get enough of from their diets. The top one is vitamin D, which I think I always kind of say like we need to take vitamin D and kind of put it aside in its own little box because dietary vitamin D can be really important, but if you are actually getting enough sun exposure, because we can make our own vitamin D in response to the sun, you don't need dietary vitamin D. So we can kind of put it in its own little box. If you just look at the rates of vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency, that's still 75% of Americans. And the farther north you live, the higher your risk. So vitamin D is definitely an important one to think of. Our best food sources are mushrooms, as long as they have grown in sunlight. So if they're generally like if they're brown mushrooms, they'll have some vitamin D. Fun fact though, you can increase the vitamin D in your mushrooms because they're fungi. Even when they're picked, they're still alive. So you can slice them up, lay them on like a baking sheet or something, and put them out in the sun for 30 to 45 minutes, and they will keep making vitamin D in response to the sun. So if you like white mushrooms, you can't do it with canned mushrooms or cooked ones, but as long as they're still raw, you can put them out. And then when you cook them, that vitamin D will stay in the food. So mushrooms and seafood are our two best sources of vitamin D. And mushrooms have this like cool hack where you can increase the vitamin D in it a lot. But nearly 100% of people don't get enough dietary vitamin D. Close to 100%. But again, it gets its own little box because we can make some of it. There aren't any other essential nutrients that we can make enough of. Everything else we have to get from food. So that's why vitamin D is kind of a special case. The next most common nutrient shortfall is potassium. So 97.8% of Americans don't get enough potassium. And potassium is kind of a fascinating one because it's actually really hard to get from food. There are no foods that have really, really high, like that you can just eat one serving of that food and you're going to get most of your potassium and you're going to be good. The only food that has more than 50% of the daily value of potassium per serving is fresh heart of palm. You unfortunately lose a lot of the potassium in the canning process. So canned heart of palm is a good source of potassium, but not like amazing like fresh. And I've never seen fresh heart of palm in a grocery store or even a cultural market. It's not a food that we get, at least in North America, very easily. So from there, right, like potatoes have 14% of the daily value per serving. Carrots have, I think, 9% of the daily value per serving. Parsnips, I think, have 8%. I think a can of tuna has 9 or 10% of the daily value. Other pretty good sources would be yogurt or dairy products like milk, or certain vegetables that are traditional in Asian cuisines or East Asian cuisines, like bamboo shoots, like water chestnuts are pretty good sources of potassium. A banana only has about 8% of the daily value. So, I mean, it's fine, it's good, but we kind of need to eat a lot of foods that have, right? We need to eat 10 foods that have 10% of the daily value of potassium per serving in a day to hit the daily value. So potassium's a tough one, and it really requires, I think, some intention to make sure we're getting enough of it, and that's why it's such a common nutrient shortfall. And our needs for potassium increase the more salt we consume. So high sodium diets, like the average diet in most Western countries, the daily value of potassium probably isn't enough, right? With the more sodium we consume, the more potassium. Ideally, we consume them in roughly equal quantities. So if you're eating the average, which is 9 grams of sodium per day, the 4.7 grams of potassium daily value, that's probably now half of what is actually required in that situation, which basically means um, potassium has become an impossibility. Potassium supplements are not a thing to play with on your own. They're incredibly caustic. They can cause things like bowel lesions. Not a fun time. There's definitely like prescription, like there's certain medications that deplete your potassium, and your doctor may have you on a potassium supplement. If that's the case, like you do what your doctor says. But if you're just like, oh, I don't get enough potassium, I'll go take a supplement, which is what diet culture has taught us. This is not one to play around with. So if you think you need a potassium supplement, talk to your doctor, but make sure that is like a medically supervised. The third most common nutrient shortfall, and this is a great, I'm so glad we came here because I alluded to this earlier, is vitamin E. So vitamin E is our main fat-soluble antioxidant. So it reduces risk of all kinds of things. Um, in some like things that you don't necessarily like think of, like allergic diseases. But vitamin E is associated with 20 some odd health outcomes. Um, and our best food sources are nuts and seeds. And like those few like fatty fruits, right? Like avocados, olives, and like olive oil, vegetable oils, generally, especially if they're virgin and not refined, will have a good amount of vitamin E. But I think our fear around the high caloric content of nuts and seeds is a large reason why such a large 96% of Americans don't get enough vitamin E. And then the fourth most common nutrient shortfall is vitamin B9, also called folate if it comes from natural sources. The synthetic form is folic acid. Folate obviously is very important for fetal development and a healthy pregnancy, which is why it's in, or folic acid is in prenatal vitamins. Folic acid is what has the track record for prenatal vitamins. There's not the same type of studies done with other forms of folate. So just making sure we're clear on that one. But even though folic acid is in the fortification program, 90.2% of Americans aren't getting enough dietary vitamin B9. And this, all of the B vitamins are required for metabolism, right? So that means that they're all sort of associated with fatigue, chronic fatigue syndrome, but also like all of the neurological conditions, like because our brain is so such an energy user, right? 20 to 25% of our calories every day are just used by our brains, doing all the brain things that our brains do. So anything that uses a lot of energy like that needs a lot of B vitamins. So when we're short of B vitamins, we see that strain on that system. So with B vitamins, we also see things like brain fog, increased age-related cognitive decline, other health conditions like that. And that's just essential nutrients, right? Like fiber is technically non-essential. It's extremely important, technically non-essential. And that's also about 95% of Americans not getting enough dietary fiber. So there's other nutrients that we can pop in there. Polyphenols, really important antioxidants, technically non-essential. It's about 90% of Americans are getting less than 300 milligrams per day. And 300 milligrams, like if we were going to set a daily value for polyphenols, they don't have one set. We'd probably set it more like 500 milligrams. So if 90% of people aren't getting 300 milligrams, like I don't know what the statistic is for 500, right? So there's all of these other really important nutrients that are like also way up there in terms of our dietary shortfalls. And a large part of that comes from how processed our food is on average, right? So the fact that 60% of calories in America are coming from ultra processed foods. We can fit ultra processed foods into a healthy diet, but we can't fit 60% in. 60% is too much. And so the more food is processed, the more of the nutrients inherent to the raw ingredients are degraded or stripped out of the food. So the more ultra processed foods someone consumes, the lower their intake of a huge collection of essential nutrients. So part of that's the problem, but the other thing is just like the eating patterns, right? The fact that the average American consumes 1.6 servings of vegetables per day when the science points to 5, right? It's those types of like mismatches between where the science at in terms of the ways of eating that support long-term health and like how how the average person eats. So part of that is an education problem, part of that is a access problem, right? A budget problem, time and energy to prepare more whole foods and fresh foods, right? So we've got these big systemic challenges to eating healthier. And then a large part of that is just the harm of diet culture, focusing our attention on calories and not on the 49 essential nutrients that we need to thrive.
Dr. Sarah, thank you so much for laying all this out so wonderfully. And I think you do such a great job of also, again, making sure you're not scaring people away when they're like, well, I'm one of those people that eats 1.6 servings of vegetables per day. How do I ever get to five? You're making it very easy and understandable for people how to get there, and also that we do need to have grace with ourselves and can enjoy ourselves a little bit, a concept which I am very big on, just making sure that people get to their healthy goal weight in a sustainable manner as well, and in a manner that allows them to live a life that they actually enjoy living. So truly, thank you for your time. Of course, I'm going to make sure to link all your handles in the show notes and the link to your book, and people will need to check all of your information out and hopefully download some of those wonderful free resources that you're providing as well.
Thank you again for having me. This was really fun.